What's up, guys? Neil Orfield here, and I'm going to show you how I will be setting up my fantasy cruncher for tonight's single game slate between the Saints and the Ravens. This is for FanDuel, and this is for the largest field GPP on FanDuel. While you're coming in, I'd appreciate it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm going to start by rearranging my columns a little bit. I've saved a quick view if you haven't already done so. I find these quick views really helpful in, getting to the columns the way I want them to look. So you can see the columns, how they look right now. I'm going to click this showdown settings quick view that I have saved. And you can see the columns moved around. Now, what I want to see in the middle of the screen is all there. Ownership projections, my projections, exposure caps, how much I get to players after I have run some crunches, et cetera, right in the middle of my screen. Makes it easier to see those things. Most of the work I do is going to be in the advanced options. I'm going to start there in the general tab and the groups tab. Starting in the general tab, unique players per lineup. I'm making 150 lineups, so I leave that at one unique player per. So my lineup's going to be one player away from each other. If you're doing 20 or fewer lineups, I think I'd recommend changing that to 2 unique players per lineup, just for some differentiation among your lineups. Team salary, I don't set a minimum. I do set a maximum for the purpose of avoiding being duplicated. If I am lucky enough to win with one of my lineups, I want to win a lot of money. I don't want to be duplicated 200 times so that I'm still not winning a lot of money. So I'm leaving some salary on the table for the purpose of avoiding being duplicated by a lot of the field. So for the purpose of this video, I'm going to leave 1,500 on the table. I'm using a max of 58,500 rather than 60,000 salary that is allowed by FanDuel, just to avoid some of those most duplicated lineups. Offensive players versus defense, the default is set to max of 2 players. I'm going to change that to 4. We just saw that win last week where we had 4 players from the Browns against the Bengals defense, I believe, was the winning lineup. It can happen. It's something that goes underutilized by the field. So I'm going to allow 4 players from one team versus just the defense of the other team. Global exposure cap, I'm going to leave at 100%. I will go in and probably set a cap at the MVP spot specifically. I don't know what I'm going to set it at yet, but I will take a look at the top single game plays tool to determine how much, where I want to set that cap, how much exposure I want to a lot of different players in the MVP spot. But I will set a cap on MVP exposures. But outside of MVP in the flex spot, I don't mind having a good amount of some individual players. Randomness I have turned on. I'm going to put that up to 50% using normal distribution randomness. If you don't have Fantasy Cruncher Pro, if you're using classic randomness, I might recommend slightly lower, maybe 30 or 40%. Also, if you want a little bit more control over your lineups, use lower randomness. It's much easier to maneuver with lower lineups, but higher randomness, speeds up the process a little bit and maybe helps you differentiate a little bit from people who are using closer to the default settings. Minimum projection included in calculation is set to 3. That means any player with below 3 fantasy point projection is not going to be included in your player pool. If I want to include a player in my player pool and their projection is below 3, I'm just going to manually boost their projection to above 3 fantasy points. So I'm not going to change this setting. I'm going to leave that at 3 and then just manually boost players if I want them to be in my player pool. Thumbs up, thumbs down, I'm going to leave that at 8% boost, plus or minus when you hit the thumbs up or thumbs down. And players from each team max, I'm going to leave that at 4. Don't mind at all having 4 players from one team against 1 from the other. All right, now I'm going to move to the groups. And I'm going to create groups typically revolving around my quarterbacks. I think these are the most important groups to set. Lamar Jackson in the MVP spot, I'm going to make my key player. And then I'm going to go ahead and add all of his receivers to a secondary group. And I'm just adding everybody who has a projection. This might change later on in the day when we get inactives. We've got some questionable players for tonight. But for now, I'm going to add every player with a projection. And if they're ruled out later, that projection should reset to 0. So no harm done. They're not going to make it into my lineups anyway. I'm only going to add Kenyon Drake among the running backs. None of the other running backs are all that involved in the passing game. And for Lamar Jackson, because he has so much rushing upside, I think that he could be the optimal MVP without bringing along any pass catchers. So I'm going to click this only apply plus minus adjustments button box. So that means that I'm not requiring any of these players to be in my lineup when I have Lamar Jackson, the MVP. But I am going to go ahead and give these players positive boosts in those lineups. So in lineups that have Lamar Jackson in the MVP spot, I'm giving boosts to his pass catchers. And there's no science to this number. This is, I guess, based a little bit on trial and error, seeing, the amount of boost I want to give to get to about the amount that I want of different players. 12% seems to be about right for most players. If they project well enough that the boost is going to get them into every single lineup that has Lamar Jackson MVP, then maybe I'll give a little bit of a lower boost. So maybe Isaiah Likely, he looks like he projects really well point per dollar. Maybe I give him a slightly lower boost because I don't want to get him in every single lineup where I have Lamar Jackson MVP. And then typically running backs, I give somewhat smaller boosts as well. Okay, I am going to leave that group for Lamar Jackson MVP. Guys, we have a great offer for new users only. You can get full access to everything Stokastic has to offer for NFL for 3 days free. Projections, ownership, 1v1 tools, lineup generator, top stacks tool, all free. Zero risk. Sign up now. The link is in the description of this video. Note that Fantasy Cruncher is an add-on and is not included in this offer. And then I'm also going to make an Andy Dalton MVP group. Going to rename this Jackson MVP as well. All right, for my Dalton MVP group, looks just like I did with Lamar Jackson. I'm going to go find Dalton in the MVP spot. And sorry, that was the wrong spot. Almost added the wrong one again. All right, Dalton in the MVP spot, going to make him my key player. And now I'm going to add all of these Saints pass catchers to my secondary group. Again, for now, just anybody with that Saints icon and a projection in these pass catching spots. So receivers, tight ends, going to include Taysom Hill, even though he's not really much of a tight end. I'm just going to include him. And then at running back, I think I'm just going to include Alvin Kamara. Could consider maybe I'll add Dwayne Washington as well. I'll have to take a look at his pass catching stats recently. Might not end up including him in the group. Anyway, for this group, for Andy Dalton, I am going to not click this box. I want to make sure that if I have Andy Dalton in the MVP spot, I'm going to have at least one pass catcher from his team. The reason being, Andy Dalton is not much of a rushing quarterback, and on every passing play, Andy Dalton is outscored by his receivers. They still, even though it's FanDuel, they still do get half a point per reception, and they get more points per yard on a passing play than Andy Dalton does. So it would be very hard for Andy Dalton to be the optimal MVP, where he's getting enough fantasy points to be in the MVP spot, but not bring along at least one pass catcher with him. And generally, I'm going to want two. I'm okay with having some lineups with just Andy Dalton and one pass catcher in the flex spots. But in general, I'm going to want more than one. So on top of requiring one, saying if any key players use Andy Dalton in the MVP spot, being that key player, then use at least one. On top of that setting, I'm also going to give boosts to the pass catchers to make it more likely that in most lineups with Andy Dalton in the MVP spot, I do have multiple Saints pass catchers. Chris Olave here projects pretty well, but he's also expensive, so I think I'm going to give him the full boost. Don't think I'm worried about having him in every single Andy Dalton MVP lineup. That's something I can check later, though. Maybe Taysom Hill, because he's not that involved as a pass catcher, doesn't get the full boost there. Alvin Kamara too, maybe Dwayne Washington. I'll have to take a look at Dwayne Washington's stats a little bit closer. That looks about right. All right, so I'm going to require at least one and then giving a little boost to make it more likely that I have multiple pass catching options when I have Dalton in the MVP spot. All right, the final group I'm going to make is Dalton in the flex as my key player. And I'm going to do the same thing, add all of his pass catchers into a secondary group. And because I have Dalton in the flex spot for this group, I can also add all of those pass catchers in the MVP spot to that secondary group. And on FanDuel, you probably don't need to worry about players who don't project very well because they're not really going to be in the MVP spot very often anyway. So probably don't need to even add them to this group. All right. And I think that's all I'm going to do for now. I'm not even going to bother giving boosts. I just want to have at least one pass catcher when I have Andy Dalton in the flex spot. So I'm going to rename this Dalton Flex. For Lamar Jackson in the flex spot, I'm not even going to bother making a group. He projects well enough, and he has enough rushing upside that he could very easily be optimal in a flex spot without bringing along any pass catchers. So I'm not even going to bother making a group. If he makes it in because of his projection naturally, that's great. But I'm not going to be giving boost to his pass catchers when I have Lamar Jackson just in the flex spot. Save this FanDuel. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and crunch out. Actually, before I do that, I am going to go to the MVP tab up here. And I'm going to set an exposure cap on players in the MVP spot. I am curious what our tools say. Okay, for FanDuel, we have Lamar Jackson as the optimal captain 24% of the time. He is the highest in that number. So maybe, you could go and you could set this. Usually I set it at 20, but because he's optimal that much of the time, that's even positive leverage on the projected ownership. Maybe you could set it at, go through and set an exposure cap of 20, and then go into Lamar Jackson specifically in the MVP spot and say for Lamar Jackson, I'd be okay with having 30% in the MVP spot. Something like that might make sense. It's not really making that decision right now, but that's what it kind of looks like, a way that I might approach it for later on. Give have a little bit more leeway for lineups with Lamar Jackson in the MVP spot. I know there will probably be some great players tonight who completely X out Lamar Jackson in the MVP spot and just spread it out with the other guys because he is not the optimal MVP, 75% of the time. Based on current projected ownership in the MVP spot, I'd rather get a little bit overweight. We'll see. Maybe that'll come up later on. Would rather be underweight, but this is what I will do for now. And now I'll go ahead and crunch out 150 lineups, see what they look like. All right, so Lamar Jackson in the MVP spot correlated with two pass catching options, one of them being a running back. Andy Dalton, at least one pass catching option, looks good. Andy Dalton in the MVP spot, only correlated with one pass catching option. I'm okay with that. I probably don't want to have a ton of lineups that have Andy Dalton in the MVP spot with just one pass catcher. I prefer to have, I think, more of them have two pass catching options, but I'm okay with having one some of the time. Another one, Andy Dalton with just one. Look at those lineups specifically. Andy Dalton in the MVP spot. All right, just one. Two here. Just one. Two here. Three here. Okay. I'm getting to a lot of Andy Dalton in the MVP spot with just one pass catcher. I could go in and give boosts to those pass catchers in lineups that have Andy Dalton in the MVP spot. In that group that I said, I could give bigger boosts to make it more likely that I get to multiple. But I want to look at my actual exposures first. Because I think if it's like DraftKings, I'm probably not getting to a lot of some of these pass catchers. All right, so quarterback spot, 61% Lamar, 33% Dalton looks good. 40% Kamara, 46% Drake, not getting to much Justice Hill, not getting to much Dwayne Washington. Currently, Dwayne Washington, Patrick Ricard, Jordan Howard, Mike Davis, none of these guys are currently in my player pool because they project for fewer than 3 fantasy points. So if you want to get to some of them, you have to actually give them boosts to their projections. And I think that I'd like to get to some Jordan Howard and some Dwayne Washington. We've got no Mark Ingram tonight, so These guys are the direct backups to Alvin Kamara, assuming that Taysom Hill doesn't just become the RB2 right away. I think these guys are certainly more likely to get run tonight with no Mark Ingram and still not projected for any ownership. So I am going to want to have, I can say pretty confidently, I'm going to want to have these guys in my lineups later on. I haven't written my article yet. I'm going to be doing more research throughout the day, but pretty sure I'm going to want those guys in my lineups, particularly on FanDuel, where they are so cheap and getting so little ownership. One touchdown might be all it takes for Dwayne Washington or Jordan Howard to be optimal. So I'll probably get them into some lineups at this low of ownership. Maybe Mike Davis, I want to have some too. Don't like him quite as much as those guys, but he's still a viable play. So maybe I want to get him above that 3 fantasy point threshold. Patrick Ricard, maybe I want him above that threshold. Again, not really making these decisions just yet. Just kind of showing you my thought process. Maybe I want more Justice Hill too. Maybe he's at 8.2% ownership. Maybe he falls into the end zone. Maybe I'll get a little bit more there. Give him a little bit of a projection boost. Chris Olave getting to 24% seems fine. Devin Duvernay, a little bit expensive on FanDuel, getting to 10%. Maybe that's okay. Demarcus Robinson, 8.9%. He's currently questionable. We'll see if he plays. Maybe I'd want a little bit more if he does play. Give him a little boost. Jarvis Landry, also questionable. We'll have to wait and see if he plays. I'm not going to change his projection. We'll have to see if he ends up playing. And then these guys, not getting to any. Rashid Shaheed, he's below 3 fantasy points. Marquez Callaway's below 3 fantasy points. Not getting much Traquan Smith. So that's why I'm not getting to a lot of lineups with multiple pass catchers from the Saints. They just don't project well enough currently to get into lineups. So if I want more, I'm just going to give them a little bit of a projection boost here. Get them into some lineups. All right, we'll have to see if Andy Isabella is active tonight. We've currently got a projection for him. Anyway, I'm not really thinking that hard about what I'm doing right now because this is all going to change throughout the day once I look at different things, look at the snap counts and routes run, that kind of stuff for writing my article. I'm probably going to change my approach a little bit, but this is just generally what I'm doing. I'm looking position by position, looking at each player. What do I think of their exposures? Do I want to get more or less of this player? Currently getting to 2.7% Taysom. I think I'd like a little bit more. I think he's a player that's really hard to project just because he does so many different things. You really don't know how much he's going to be involved in the game plan, but he's had some really big spike weeks this year. So I think I'd like to get to some Taysom, maybe some Juwan Johnson as well. Only 8.1% projected ownership. Guys, we have a great offer for new users only. You can get full access to everything Stokastic has to offer for NFL for 3 days free. Projections, ownership, 1v1 tools, lineup generator, top stacks tool, all free. Zero risk. Sign up now. The link is in the description of this video. Note that Fantasy Cruncher is an add-on and is not included in this offer. Oliver. Want to get some Nick Vannett. Have to make sure he projects for at least 3 fantasy points. I don't know if I want any Holtz or Boyle. I'll give him the 3 fantasy points, though, for now. This is a pretty low amount of these kickers that I'm getting to. Maybe I want to give a little boost there. And then DST also not getting to much at all. Maybe give a little boost there. And then I crunch out again. This is just all it is to my process. I make sure I have correlations that I like, which I set up in those groups earlier. And then I make sure I get to exposure levels that I like of each player. That's all it really takes. No real science to it. It's just based on some feel and some making sure I have good correlations. And now am I getting to any of these wide receivers? All right, so now I am getting to still not a lot of Marquez Callaway, Traquan Smith. So I'm still probably going to run into the same issue I was running into before, where most of my Andy Dalton MVPs were single stack. So I'm going to give these guys slightly bigger boosts right away. And I'm going to crunch it out again. All right, a little bit more. Still not a ton, but let's take a look at my Andy Dalton MVP lineups. So now I'm getting Dalton with 2, Dalton with 2. That does include Taysom, who is nominally a pass catching option. Dalton with 1, Dalton with 1, Dalton with 1, Dalton with 1. So I'm still kind of running into that same issue. Maybe I don't want to drastically increase these guys' projections anymore. Maybe I mostly only want to have some of these guys in lineups that have Dalton in the MVP spot. So then what I do is I'd go back into advanced options, groups, find my Dalton MVP group, and just increase their boost a little bit to make it a little bit more likely that I get 2 when I have Dalton in the MVP spot. Okay. Not sure how much that 2% increase is going to do for me, but I want to try it out again. And I did get slightly more of these guys. Still looking like I'm getting to a lot of Dalton with just 1 pass catcher. I'm going to just incrementally change these things. This is kind of my approach. I go incrementally, crunch it out, look at what it looks like, make small changes here and there, either to the projection or just coming in here and giving bigger boosts. Crunch out 150 again. Yeah, it didn't really do much in terms of how much exposure I got to those guys. So these incremental changes are not so far having a huge effect. But as I continue to boost them, I think they will. Still, maybe it's because I'm giving bigger boosts to the... No, it's still not really not having the effect that I'm expecting here. I'm going to try it one more time. Dalton MVP. Because these are pretty significant boosts that I'm giving. All right, what's going on here? Do have randomness on. Just going to experiment right now just to see if this is working at all. Give bigger boosts. Because so far those small boosts are not changing anything. All right, I'm not sure why this is not working the way I would expect it to. Normally, I'd be seeing more of these guys than I am right now. Still seeing Dalton. All right, I guess we got 4 here, just 1 here. A lot of Dalton with just 1 pass catcher. So this is okay. I am getting to some with more though. Interesting. So I'm not seeing exactly what I would expect here, where I'm giving bigger boosts. I'm going to try this one more time because it's not really making any impact right now at all when I'm giving these boosts. slight impact there, but look, Callaway 8%, 6-6. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. So I've got a 50% increase on Callaway's 6 projection should bring him to 9. Traquan Smith should be at 9. So these are pretty big boosts that I'm giving to these guys' projections in my Dalton MVP lineups. All right, so I'm going to look at some of those lineups. So should boost them above James Prochet, but I guess he's a little bit cheaper. Maybe it's just the range of with the price cap. I'm not able to get to these guys over guys like James Prochet and Andy Isabella because they're 5,000. These guys are, let's see, Callaway 6,500, Traquan Smith 6,500. So maybe it's just the price range. It's just even with the boost, they don't project well enough to get to those guys in the 9,000 range, but they are too expensive to fit into some of these lineups. I don't know. This is a bit perplexing to me why I'm not getting to more of these guys than I am in my Dalton MVP lineups. Anyway, this is the general, the kinds of experiments that I do until I get to lineups that I want that look the way I want them to look. You can see I am getting to more of Dalton with multiple pass catchers than I was previously. So maybe I'm just overestimating the amount that I expect to get to these guys overall. I'm just getting to less of them in lineups that don't have Dalton in the MVP, but my Dalton MVP lineups are looking a lot more heavily stacked than they were previously. So maybe it is working to some extent, and I'm just getting to fewer than I was in non-Dalton MVP lineups than I was previously. Maybe that's just going on. Kind of a surprise to me that I am getting to fewer elsewhere, but yeah, these lineups are actually looking more correlated, that I am getting more pass catchers with Dalton in the MVP spot. So I guess it is working, just for some reason getting to fewer of these guys outside of Dalton MVP lineups than I was previously. So I'm getting to 20% Callaway in Dalton MVP lineups, 13% Traquan, 10% Shaheed, whereas in non-Dalton MVP lineups, I'm getting to 8%, 6%, 6% overall. So the boosts are working, just not quite to the extent that I was expecting them to get more of those guys. I'm just getting to them more in my Dalton MVP lineups and less elsewhere. And I do have randomness on, so that can be a factor too. I would have expected with the boost that I gave to get more of them than I am, but not happening quite that way. Anyway, I am getting to actually better correlated lineups than I was previously. So the boosts are working. Typically, I mean, I have never actually done what I'm doing right here, which is giving 50% boost. As you saw, I started with 12%. Typically would not recommend giving this huge of boost, but maybe I guess in certain builds, certain ways you want to construct, maybe it does make sense. If you only want these guys in lineups with the quarterback at MVP, I guess it could make sense. Just not typically the way I do things. These are pretty enormous boosts to be giving some of these guys. Anyway, I think in general, it is working out kind of the way I wanted it to, where I'm looking at my lineups, and when I've got Dalton in the MVP spot, I have at least a couple pass catchers, maybe a little bit overboard with that 50% boost, where a lot of times I'm getting to 3 pass catchers. Maybe that's okay though. Lamar Jackson, 2 pass catchers here. That looks good. Didn't require any pass catchers with Lamar Jackson at MVP because of the rushing upside, but still like to see 1 or 2 typically when I have him in the MVP spot. And when I've got Dalton in the flex, I've got at least 1 pass catcher along with him. So in general, these are, although it didn't work exactly how I wanted it to, how I thought it was going to, it did end up working out okay, where I'm correlating a little bit more within these lineups, which was the goal. So overall, looking pretty good there. And, later on after inactives come out, I will be going through once again, position by position, looking at the exposure levels that I'm getting to of different players. Maybe I'd want more of these guys. These kickers give a little bit of boost to the projection. Keep in mind, if you do this, if you go through and actually change the projections, all projections are relative to each other. So if you're giving boosts to every player, doesn't really do all that much if you're given the same amount, the same relative to each other percentage. It's not really going to change anything. You have to be keeping in mind all projections as you are making adjustments, looking at how much do I want of this guy relative to this other player as you are making decisions. So just something to keep in mind. Still getting to a ton of Isaiah Likely. Again, not going to go through and actually make any player decisions right now. If you want my thoughts on actual players, I'm going to be writing an article today, and I'm also going to be on Live Before Lock tonight. So I will give more opinions on actual players there. For here, I'm just trying to kind of show you how to use Fantasy Cruncher to build well-correlated lineups and how my general process looks. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Hope you can find some success tonight using this or a similar process. Good luck.